Toys R Us use its name?
Filled with toys for girls and boys in every kind of game. There's a great store in town.
A magical store.
A ton of fun for everyone, so come and explore. The choices are so big, big, big. The prices are so low. Whoa, come in, have a ball. You know we've got it all at the biggest toy store, Toys R Us.
It was the early 1990s. Toys R Us, a highly successful toy chain in America, had set its sights on expanding globally during the 1980s, opening stores around the world in Canada, the UK, and Japan, just to name a few. In each country, the company managed to dominate the toy industry and build up a significant presence. For some years, Toys R Us were eyeing off building stores in Australia, presumably to achieve the same result and take advantage of a growing industry. Enter Coles Myer to the story. Coles Myer, through its established department store business, held an iron grip over the toy game in Australia. By that point, the company had controlled 40.5% of toy sales each year. So when Toys R Us announced plans to enter Australia in March of 1993, Coles Myer had every right to be afraid of losing its tight grip over the toy market. Their plan was to copy Toys R Us and launch a kids' superstore chain of their own.
If you think this is big, wait till you see the toy store. It's really, really big. World for kids. It's big. World for kids.
Coles Myer hastily put together this new chain, which would be named World for Kids, in an attempt to soften the damage of its competitor's arrival. With a short window to launch the concept, the team Coles Myer had assembled spent just over 6 months bringing World for Kids to life. World for Kids was effectively a copy-paste of the Toys R Us model in every regard. The stores were designed to be huge, often sized similarly to a Target or Kmart, albeit entirely dedicated to kids items sold at the lowest prices possible. This concept was totally new to the Australian market at the time. There were always smaller toy store chains. However, toy sales were at their best at the department stores as they had prime retail space in shopping centres. Merging both of these concepts is what Toys R Us had been doing in America for decades to enormous success. Their rapid growth to hundreds of stores across America and their dominance over toy sales was what was described as a category killer, which is now commonly used to describe a large retail specialty store that dominates the market through selling goods at lower prices. Critics, on the other hand, were far more pessimistic. Analysts noted that the average spend of Australians on toys was far lower than what it was overseas, and doubted the success of a toy superstore chain, let alone 2 of them. Even the World for Kids managing director, Chris Kelly, had said, quote, "I don't think there is room for 2 major toy chains. One of them will rise above the other in the next few years." Such was it a last-minute affair that Coles Myer and Toys R Us were engaging in bidding wars over leases in shopping centre spaces. Coles Myer and Toys R Us were both so confident that they signed huge leases for their stores. Inexplicably, Coles Myer had won its last-minute race with Toys R Us, as the first World for Kids store opened its doors in August of 1993. World for Kids didn't stop Toys R Us from opening, however. When the first stores opened just a few weeks later, it blew World for Kids out of the water in every category. The product offering and customer experience that Toys R Us offered was far superior to that of World for Kids. For example, the average World for Kids store took up an average of just under 2,000 square meters in retail space. Toys R Us stores were generally far bigger, most at around 3,500 square meters. Some Toys R Us stores had opened with 2 levels. In the first year, 8 million people had walked through the doors of World for Kids. For Toys R Us, that number was 20 million. By the end of the year, World for Kids had 11 locations nationwide. That number would increase to 17 by the end of the following year. At Coles Myer, not all was pretty and well. In its first year, World for Kids had lost $25.6 million for Coles Myer. A disappointing figure, but not rare for a new venture. After all, Officeworks, which was pretty much brand new at the time, had posted a $2.4 million loss for the year. But that was only just the beginning. The following year, World for Kids had its losses grow to $33 million for the year. Expansion plans were still aggressive, with 8 stores slated to open that following year. Analysts were confused over Coles' commitment to World for Kids. The chief executive of IBIS Business Information, Mr. Phil Ruthven, had said, quote, "Coles is close to $16 billion in total sales and might hope to achieve about $600 million a year from toys. They are spending a lot of money and time and effort for something that is not likely to ever show great returns. World for Kids is purely defensive, and there are doubts it will end up dominating the market." Toys R Us was about the same, losing about $12.1 million for the year. It wasn't anywhere near as bad as its local rival, but regardless of the fact, the result wasn't anywhere near what the company was expecting. Over at Coles Myer, the faith in World for Kids had started to falter. It had left quite a significant dent in the company's earnings. Shareholders were running out of patience. They wanted the sinking World for Kids gone. By 1996, Coles Myer was openly calling World for Kids' performance disappointing and decided to pull the plug on expansion plans. By doing this, Coles Myer had effectively given up on competing with Toys R Us. For that year, World for Kids had lost $35.8 million, its biggest loss yet, and operated a peak of 23 stores, compared to the 22 of Toys R Us. But this wouldn't last long. The next year, Coles Myer had announced plans to integrate the back-of-house operations of World for Kids into Kmart. 8 stores were closed, and many of the existing stores were shrunk. This created a small loss of $20.8 million, but this just wasn't enough. Over at Toys R Us, about 22 stores were operational nationwide. By 1998 though, just 10 World for Kids stores were left operational. It was also the year in which World for Kids was finally axed. Coles Myer had labelled World for Kids' continuing losses as no longer significant, and announced plans to wind down the World for Kids brand after just 5 years of operation. At the time of the announcement, 7 stores were still open. All of them were closed down in the next 3 years as their leases expired, with the last stores closing their doors in 2002. In just 9 years, Coles Myer's big crack at the toy superstore format had gone from being their attempt to ward off Toys R Us to a failure that crashed and burned. All told, Coles Myer had spent more than $200 million on their last-minute attempt to stop Toys R Us. What they got was a store chain that couldn't even survive a decade. World for Kids was nothing short of a disaster. Toys R Us had seemingly won the battle. But in reality, it wasn't. In truth, both Toys R Us and Coles Myer had overestimated the appeal of the toy warehouse concept. The toy market in Australia wasn't even close to that of what it was overseas. As one toy retailer had told Business Review Weekly in 1997, at any other time of the year, you could fire a gun through most toy stores and not hit anyone. Financing big inventories in such a seasonal market is not easy. At that time, it was estimated that up to half of annual toy sales in Australia took place in December. For the next decade or so, Toys R Us ticked along. However, the company's hopes to dominate the industry were dashed. Stores that took up vast amounts of real estate in high-profile locations such as Melbourne Central, Rundle Mall and Hay Street didn't last long. Losses piled up. However, the company still had hugely profitable operations overseas, which it could fall back on. Sales grew slowly each year, and Toys R Us was able to only secure a market share of about 12% by the end of the 1990s, well below what the company had originally hoped. Toys R Us wouldn't turn a profit in Australia until 2000, but yet the following years were still grim. As early as 2004, Toys R Us was experiencing a few lean years. The American company was seriously considering divesting its Australian arm, or closing it down completely, after losses piled up once again. In that year, the Australian operation had lost over $30 million. By then, the only reason Toys R Us and its 34 stores remained open in Australia was due to it being bankrolled by the American parent. Nonetheless, Toys R Us managed to survive and operated quietly for the next decade. As the 2010s rolled around, and as its American parent began losing money year on year, Toys R Us continued to grow in Australia, eventually expanding to a peak of 44 stores. In September 2017, it was announced that the American parent company would be filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company had been faced with enormous debt following its leveraged buyout 12 years earlier, and struggled to shave it in the face of online competition. However, it was then announced immediately that the Australian stores weren't affected by this. But the future was looking grim for both companies, as Toys R Us shopped buyers for their stores to no avail. Toys R Us wasn't just in a hole overseas, it was struggling in Australia yet again. The department stores had remained the big players in the toy market. However, the quick rise of online specialty retail had left Toys R Us in a precarious spot. In a twist of irony, Kmart remained Australia's #1 toy retailer. In the years after World for Kids, Coles Myer was renamed Coles Group before being bought by Wesfarmers in 2007. It, along with Woolworths Group's Big W, were easily the big players in Australian toy sales in the 2010s, with Toys R Us a distant non-factor. The discount chain's success was quite simple. They were beating Toys R Us at their own game, especially when it came down to pricing. For example, it would typically cost you more to buy a Lego set at Toys R Us when compared to buying it from Kmart. While Kmart and Big W didn't necessarily have the range of Toys R Us, it was sufficient enough for them to get by. The amount of big box Toys R Us stores that existed was staggering. Many of these stores were in bizarre locations, such as this one in Penrith, which was tucked away off the main road, hidden behind a bunch of restaurants. People go to big box stores for simple everyday goods like groceries, furniture, tools, even office supplies, not for comparatively niche markets like toys. For a time, Toys R Us had recognised this. Far more stores were located in malls when compared to other countries. But many of these had died off once leases became too expensive to remain profitable. All said and done, Toys R Us never had the success it anticipated. The company simply lacked the presence that it did in other countries, and had never gained the market share that it was able to in other countries. Toys R Us had operated enough to stay open, but the reality was that the Australia expansion was largely a failure. Many of the stores were in awkward locations, the merchandise was more expensive than its competition, the infrastructure to run the stores was expensive to run, and the inventory was far too big for a market that never really grew to the extent that they believed it would. On the 21st of May, 2018, Toys R Us Australia announced that it would enter voluntary administration. Not long after, it was announced that Toys R Us would be closing its doors permanently, within a 6-week period. 700 part and full-time employees would lose their jobs.
Hundreds of people are set to lose their jobs with Toys R Us stores around Australia to be shut down. Administrators failed to find a buyer for the 44 toys and baby goods stores, putting 700 people out of work. The company has been trading since entering voluntary administration in May, but now administrators McGrath Nichols say all potential buyers have pulled out and the business has to be wound down. Stock will be liquidated through sales at stores before they close in the coming weeks. The online ordering system will be closed on the 22nd of June.
The last stores closed their doors on August 4th, 2018, and so a war lasting nearly 25 years had finally come to a close. Despite its disastrous attempt at going head-to-head with them in the 90s, it was ultimately Coles Myer who ended up having the last laugh. As a matter of fact, Toys R Us seldom made a profit in Australia. In 25 years of operation, Toys R Us had lost an eye-watering $463.5 million. The Toys R Us name changed hands a few times after the stores closed, ultimately being purchased by local company Funtastic in 2021, who changed their own name to Toys R Us. These days the company still exists, but as an online retailer. However, physical stores are due to open starting in 2024. Whether these stores will repeat its predecessor's success, or lack thereof, is still unclear. Though with Kmart and Big W still ticking along, local company Toymate filling the specialty retail void, and toy companies such as LEGO building their own stores that double as experiences, I find it really hard to believe that they'll be able to make an impact. 30 years ago, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by two major retail giants in an expensive scrap for control over the toy sector, and yet these top dollar efforts would amount to very little for all involved. As one toy retailer had put it, Toys R Us and World for Kids thought they could walk into the toy market and crush the little guys. They were wrong. While their arrival lowered prices and shrunk the smaller local retailers, with the number of independent toy stores being cut in half by 1995, the independents managed to bounce back a few years later. Many of them, like Toy World and Casey's Toys, have managed to outlive the superstores and still operate to this day. Neither World for Kids nor Toys R Us managed to grow to the extent they thought they were able to. World for Kids was a disaster from the beginning, while Toys R Us failed to make the impact that its parent company had hoped for, limping along for decades until it too faded into history. As analysts had warned, both failed to move the sales needle in the market that they operated in. But for now, the war between an American industry giant and an Australian retail powerhouse is now just a footnote in history. This is what's left of the Australian toy war of the 1990s.